It's a pleasure to be here. I've been having the pleasure of meeting some of you in the last days, and I hope your program is going well. Let me start by telling you what I'm going to do in my 15 minutes. I am going to steer away from burdening you with more Egyptian details. In light of the fact that you have 3 Egyptian participants in your course, I take it that you've been hearing much about Egypt, informally, formally, in discussions. So I'm not going to engage in a detailing effort of what has been happening in Egypt since 2011 up until today. I would like much more actually to focus on 3 points in a way to engage the literature you've been reading. I had the opportunity of looking at your reading materials, and I listened to parts of Larry's presentation earlier today. So what I would like to do is, one, to engage what Larry was saying or briefly mentioned in relation to the autocratic playbook. I would like to share some features, structural features of that autocratic playbook as they have been unfolding in Egypt in recent years, which is, to my mind, probably an easier way of engaging you and your different case studies you're interested in, or countries where you're coming from and working on. So that's going to be number one. The second point is I would like to have a bit of discussion, initial discussion about the root causes. Why? Because once again, I believe when you look at the literature on Egypt, in general, the literature on the so-called Arab Spring, you really, in general, find 2 approaches. One, that it was doomed to fail. Structurally, it was doomed to fail. And then you have a list of factors, socioeconomic, cultural, institutional, political, why it was doomed to fail, why Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain were doomed to fail. And the second approach is more of a focus on actors, on the agency question. So what kind of strategic mistakes, what kind of tactical mistakes actors have committed. I would like to share a bit of ideas about the root causes using these 2 approaches. And finally, in light of what has been happening in Egypt, what is out there in civil society, because it's not true that the autocratic playbook has been able to impose itself, and autocrats have been able to impose their will without resistance. So there's an interesting process of an emergent resistance, which I would like to share some insights about. Okay, now on the playbook, to my mind, there are 5 structural features of the autocratic playbook as it has been unfolding in Egypt. Number 1 is the very fact that Egypt's backsliding on the brief and chaotic democratic transition between 2011 and 2013 has come in the context of the military establishment, the security services, and their allies in the business community, as well as in the state bureaucracy, developing, fashioning a convincing popular narrative. So it's not that we woke up in Egypt on June 30th or July 3rd to find the army takeover happening. No, there were beginnings since 2011, since a democratic uprising led to the removal of former President Mubarak. There were beginnings of these gateholders, these power actors on the ground, the military, the security, their allies in the business community and in the media landscape, and media played a huge role, attempts to fashion and develop a counter-democratic narrative and a convincing and popular counter-democratic narrative. And this counter-democratic narrative has been in Egypt based on 3 elements, which I'm just going to highlight. And I guess Yasmin was referring to one of them. One was fine. So citizens took to the street in 2011 to remove an autocratic leader and had great expectations about economic improvement, about political improvement, anti-corruption measures, transitional justice, and what have you. None of these expectations were met. So element 1 is in the counter-democratic narrative was, fine, your expectations were not met, and you're getting nowhere close to meeting these expectations as long as you depend on democratic forces, simply because they do not know how to rule. So political parties, liberal, leftist, Islamists do not know how to rule. They haven't been part of the state business for a very long time. They lack experience. Your expectations will not be met. And especially the focus or the zeroing in process was on the security issue. So we lack security. Security conditions have been deteriorating, a rise of violent acts of violence, the rise of terrorist attacks, primarily in Sinai and elsewhere, and using the fact that security has been eroded or was eroding since 2011 in fashioning and pushing forward that autocratic narrative. The second element in the autocratic narrative has basically been we, and the we refers to that conglomerate of the military establishment, security services, the state bureaucracy, media, business, and including some officials, public servants in the judiciary. And I'm going to go back to what you, Mariam, was referring to in relation to Pakistan. So it's an interesting interplay between generals and judges that has been unfolding in Egypt as well in recent years. But that conglomerate, the second point is that we know how to rule. We know how to move you forward. So forget about these changes. The changes happen. The autocrat is already somewhere else. So bring it back to us. We are the true actors on the ground who can rule the state, who can manage the state affairs in a manner which would serve your interests. So that image of stability actors and stability actors in uniform was key in the autocratic, counter-democratic narrative that was developed. And the last element was look around you, which is key. And I mean, the Arab Spring has been, of course, a regional process, but the counter-revolution has been a regional process as well. So the Arab Spring sparked from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Bahrain to Libya and Syria, and the counter-revolution has been moving in regional, in a regional manner as well. And that look around you was look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Yemen, and look at Iraq, and we Egyptians should avoid the fate of a collapsed order, of a collapsed state, of a collapsed society. In fact, very recently, the current Egyptian president was urging media to start injecting that sense of, unless we hold together, of course that holding together means submitting to his will, the state runs the risk of its authority being eroded, and a state collapse looms very large in the background. So a convincing narrative that should not be ignored. So it's not that we woke up in July 2013 to see a military takeover. Second key item in the autocratic playbook is the centrality of lawmaking. The Egyptian current regime is not a rogue regime. It's not that they kill, they detain, they work against freedom of expression and association. They expel university professors, very similar to what has been happening in Turkey. But they do not do it, part of their playbook is to do it based on existing laws, or introducing, which has been key, introducing new laws and legal amendments to account for that. So detention of young activists, for thousands of them have been detained since 2013, gets accounted for by a mechanism of introducing new laws and new amendments to existing laws. Anti-terrorism law, amendments to the penal code, amendments to in total, a number of around 400 laws and legal amendments have been introduced in Egypt since 2013. So on average, 100 every year since the military takeover in July 2013. And lawmaking as a process has been used to reach three objectives, which I'm once again highlighting in a very brief manner. Number one, to undermine freedom of expression and association. 2011 was about citizens taking to the public space to express their views freely and to demand accountability and to practice freedom of association. And a great deal of these laws and legal amendments are tailored to undermine freedom of expression and association, or to penalize freedom of expression and freedom of association. Secondly, to subject the legislature as well as the judicial branch of government to the will of the executive branch of government, leading to submission of the legislature. The current parliament in Egypt is a submissive legislature. It does not contradict the will of the executive branch of government. In the 400 laws, only one government initiative, one government legal initiative was stopped by the parliament in a total number of around 400. And in relation to the judiciary, eating away, eroding the autonomy, the historical autonomy of the judiciary in Egypt. Finally, these laws and legal amendments have been designed to create new government control tools, which I find as a political scientist very interesting. This is not that they simply amend laws or enshrine new restrictions or penalties. No, they create new government tools. So we have an agency populated by security and intelligence officers to oversee the operation of civil society. We have multiple agencies overseeing the media landscape, public and private owned media landscape. So the creation of new government tools to reassert state control, to reassert the regime control. So lawmaking, its centrality. And I feel reminded a lot when I read about permanent initiatives to issue new laws and legal amendments in Egypt. I feel reminded from a completely different context of what Hannah Arendt used to refer to the concentration camps as a point of crystallization of totalitarianism. I feel in Egypt, when I look at the autocratic playbook, the point of crystallization is how they use laws. Is the lawmaking process. This is a point of crystallization where you see the reality of the current autocracy in Egypt without a great deal of shadows coming close to it. Third element is extinction of autonomous, independent civil society and media. Once again, without going into great details, this has been a key focus of the current autocracy in Egypt for two reasons. One, I guess their takeaway from 2011 is that 2011 happened simply because the former autocratic government, the government of former President Mubarak, let spaces for civil society and media to operate relatively freely. So their takeaway is not that these spaces were not enough, and therefore citizens took to the street to express their will to demand more freedom of association and expression. It's exactly the other way around, that it happened, 2011 happened, because some spaces were left unoccupied by the state and by state authorities. So a war of extinction on media and civil society. Number 4 in the autocratic playbook in Egypt is within the executive branch of government, there is a clear rise in action and sphere of influence of the security services. This is no longer a regime or a government where we have even close to a balance within the executive branch of government between security and non-security elements. The security services, their sphere of influence, their sphere of action has been expanding over time, has been penetrating other elements of the state bureaucracy. So look at civilian ministries, be it the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Social Affairs. In the two cases, as different as they are, these ministries are being managed, micromanaged by the security in the details, in the day-to-day operation. So these are the 5 features of the autocratic playbook as they unfold in Egypt. And I'm adding to what Larry was referring to. I say we really need to look at the details of the narrative and how the narrative has been fashioned, developed, and communicated to citizens, because it's maybe lacking popular approval rates is a feature of some autocratic government, but this is not the case in Egypt. This current autocratic government continues to command some popularity, and which should not be denied. Root causes, second big point. Now, so away from the two approaches of we were doomed to fail or strategic and tactical mistakes, I believe there are, once again, 2 elements which I would like to highlight, and I'm trying to work on them in my current writings. Number 1 is an appreciation in an academic sense, not because I like them, but an appreciation of the significance of traditions within the state apparatus. The Egyptian state as it has been created, the modern Egyptian state as it has been created in the beginnings of the 19th century, as it has evolved over time in the last 200 years, this state has had stable traditions. And these traditions have been key in understanding why we did not make it in terms of an easy, not swift, but an easy, less problematic democratic transition. One key element in historical traditions is the fact that the executive branch of government has defined how the state apparatus has come to be shaped. It was a key role from the very beginning. And in fact, within the executive branch of government, it was the so-called institutions of discipline. The army, the security services, after the 1950s, the intelligence community, but they have always been at the forefront of the executive branch of government. So in a way, we did not come to an appreciation between 2011 and 2013 on how to manage this very fact that this is an imbalanced state structure. This is not a state where the legislature or where the judicial branch of government have been having more than a symbolic autonomy, a bit of a historical symbolic autonomy, but in reality, the day-to-day management of state affairs has always come back to the primacy of the executive branch of government. So how to manage that? And here, even tactically, we should have developed different answers, engaging or not engaging. I mean, we answered a great deal of questions in an ideological manner, which took us nowhere. But so historical traditions. The second element with regard to the root causes is, once again, appreciating political culture. And I believe this is not simply about reducing the whole picture to look at voting behaviors, but voting behavior and voter preferences between 2011 and 2013, and what has been happening and why they a majority opted to vote for religious-based actors and parties. And no, it's actually much more about how citizens see the state and how citizens understand questions such as security and who is in charge of it and who is supposed to deliver security and accountability. Because I find it striking that at a certain point in time, especially in the summer of 2013, Egyptians were willing, a majority was willing to see not only bloodshed, but a massacre unfolds in the streets of Cairo uncommented in the name of security. So there are elements in the political culture in Egypt which really we need to look at and segment it in a constituency driven analysis to see who is demanding what, who is out looking for what, and what kind of collection, what was the collection of demands which brought citizens in 2011 to the street. Because the irony is, to a great extent, the same people who took to the street in 2011 demanding democratic transition took out to the streets in 2013 demanding an end to that process of democratic transition. So we really have to come to terms with what has been happening historically in political culture. Finally, the last point in 1 minute, Larry, which I would like to share is, in view of what has been happening since 2013, once again, to push forward the notion that this social fabric, which has created a great deal of noise in Egypt, not since 2011, since 2003 and 4 and even earlier, that this social fabric has come to be silent is not true. So we have emerging forms of resistance against this new autocracy and the autocratic playbook. And what's interesting is that what I'm seeing is a combination of old forms of activism and new forms of activism. So we have a revival of professional syndicates happening and unfolding in Egypt, taking you back to similar images which we used to see in the 1980s, as we had no. I mean, the one key point in the new forms and old forms of activism is that the informal politics and its spaces and actors have lost significance. Parties are almost non-significant in Egypt as of today, and spaces such as a parliamentary space have lost a great deal of their significance as well. So what's happening is, away from formal politics, in the informal arena, a revival of older forms of activism, professional associations, student movements, labor movements, and an emergence of new forms of activism, which I find very interesting as well. Single cause initiatives, focusing on issues such as torture in places of custody, not championing all human rights abuses and violations, but only one. So that's what's happening against it. This is not a social fabric which has come to be silent. Even or in spite of that autocratic playbook, it continues to resist, and not in a highly efficient manner in the sense of undermining the autocratic authority, but these issues need to be factored in and looked at, factoring in the time dimension. It's bound to take time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amr, for giving us a little hope at the end. And now, Abbas.
Let me talk about Iran. I think Iran is, in a sense, one of the most paradoxical countries in the region today. And I mean by paradoxical that it has a very vibrant, active civil society. It has regular elections, controlled and constrained, but regular. It has about 70% population participation in these elections. Once the list of the election candidates has been approved by the top clergy, there is generally a viable competitive process. The social media in Iran is remarkable. I'll be telling you a little bit about it. But nevertheless, Iran is controlled still, by and large, by a very small coterie of clerics who are committed to a very, very antiquarian idea of legitimacy. They think they derive their legitimacy not in a democratic process, not through popular election, but through divine intervention. Khamenei and his coterie truly believe, or at least truly claim they believe, that they received their legitimacy from the skies, and that the earth and the people on it have very little to do with it. And if people have anything to do with it, as conservative clerics would tell you, is to show absolute obedience to his will. And it's always his will. And although Iran, again, one of the signs of this paradox, Iran has some of the most misogynist laws on books, but it also has one of the most vibrant women's movement in terms of their presence in the social media, in terms of their presence in the entrepreneurial class, in the writerly class, in the intellectual discourse. Last year was for the first time in Iran's history where the number of books published by women in all fields, the total number of books published by women in Iran exceeded the number of published books by men. And this is a society, again, whose official ideology, as proclaimed by Ayatollah Khamenei, for example, is that the best place for women is at home, and the role that they are best suited for is motherhood. Iranian women are defying this, and this has created the paradox that I'm trying to discuss. And I think it's very important whether the authoritarian creep that Larry was talking about will emerge in the Middle East, or whether there is a democratic creep possibility in the region. Iran will be a very important test case. And there is, I think, room for some optimism, some cautious optimism about what is happening in Iran. And I think the entire paradox that I'm trying to explain can be captured in the last election and in its consequences. Election was held in May to elect the new president. Iran has a president that has some power, but has in the constitution also a supreme leader. Today it is Mr. Khamenei. He has been the supreme leader for 28 years. Iran has had only two supreme leaders, the founder, Mr. Khomeini, and now Mr. Khamenei for the past 27 years. And there is a disproportionate amount of power that is given to this office. In the Constitution initially, and in 1988, they revised the Constitution. They changed the name of that office, and they gave it far more power. Again, in the book that Larry and I edited, there is an article by Naraghi, a very brilliant political scientist from Iran, who was very active in the opposition movement, but now teaches in the US. He has written a very cogent article about the legal transformation. We went from having a velayat faqih, or the rule of the Jurist Council, to velayat mutlaqi faqih, the absolute rule of the Jurist Council. And the powers invested, and legal powers invested in that office were increased. And with Khamenei and his alliance with the Revolutionary Guards, his reliance on the intelligence agencies, has enabled them to even further expand in that office. An office of the supreme leader that during Khomeini had 60 staff, today is reported to have over 11,000 staff. They interfere in virtually every aspect of society. So you have in every domain parallel governments, if you will, or parallel power, or as Lenin used to call dual power. You have the power of Khomeini and his representatives, unelected, unimpeachable. They control a vast amount of wealth. Reuters has estimated that Khomeini controls more wealth than even Putin. The amount of wealth he controls through the IRGC front organizations, through the religious endowments, through special accounts that get a percentage of, for example, every car sold in Iran, one small percentage goes to this account that Khomeini controls and doesn't pay taxes on it, doesn't allow anyone to look at the books. And it is estimated that that office controls something like $90 billion. A lot of money that is spent in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, funding proxy groups is the money that is from these funds. So there is an expanded control in this unelected, unimpeachable, and thus very undemocratic office. But there's also an office of the president that is elected through controlled elections. The first elections in Iran were a reflection of the Iranian democratic process, the democratic movement in 1979, that was in a sense usurped by the clergy. Iranians did not go to a revolutionary process to create a despotic regime ruled by the clerics. If you look at the studies that have been done on it, it is very clear. If you look at what Khomeini was saying on the eve of the revolution, Khomeini was essentially promising a democracy in Iran, a la the Fifth Republic in France. The first constitution they drafted for Iran, in fact, was exactly modeled on the French Fifth Republic. In Iran, Khomeini realized the weakness of the democratic forces. That constitutional draft was thrown away. A new constitutional draft was created, and it was the one that created this dual power structure. Little power in the office of the presidency, a great deal of power, undemocratic power, unchecked power, unimpeachable power in the supreme leader. So the Iranian people have been, in my view, for 37 years, trying to take this limited share of power that has been allotted to them in the election and through the electoral process to send repeated messages to the leadership that the status quo, its undemocratic nature, its misogynist nature, its incompetence, its statist policy is not in the best interest of Iran. Its adventurism in the region is not in the best interest of Iran. And they're trying to chip away at the power of the supreme leader through this incremental process, through this evolutionary process. In 2009, I think a larger crowd than any in the Arab Spring, as Roger Cohen estimates it to be 3 million, came into the streets of Tehran to challenge what was clearly, in my view, a rigged election that gave us 4 more years of Ahmadinejad and his utter incompetence and his utter lunacies in denying the Holocaust and pursuing nuclear policy that was absolutely disastrous for Iran and led Iran to have no choice but to make the compromise that Iran made in the nuclear deal. But that few million people very soon decided that they're not going to challenge the regime frontally. When the regime made its assault, people retreated. They retreated because, again, in discussions about the region, in discussions of Egypt, we just heard about a region that is filled with failing or failed state, with control, with countries that are ruins. And the Iranian regime has been extremely clever in its advertisement to show images of Iraq, to show images of Syria, to show images of Afghanistan. And the message has been very, very clear. It's not implied that if you challenge the regime frontally, what has happened in Syria, with the help of Iran, as Assad's main ally next to Russia, will happen, what has happened in Syria will happen in Iran. And I think the Iranian people are truly trying to do the very difficult, but maybe not impossible task of changing the regime without having a regime change, of chipping away at the power of authoritarianism without having a revolution. Does this risk the chance of allowing the people to be used by the authoritarian regime to re-legitimize itself every 4 years? I think it absolutely does. But is there other alternatives? I think the people of Iran have decided that there is no other alternative. In the last election, 25 million people voted for Rouhani, who stood clearly, unambiguously, as a rejection of the status quo. And a status quo that he himself had been very influential in creating. But it is the politics of a choice of incrementalism that I think the people have made. I followed the election very closely in social media and through the Iranian media, through some interviews, and it was a remarkable level of sophisticated organization, not just inside Iran, but also outside Iran. I have to say that, in my view, one of the missing discussions, missing aspects of the discussion about the future of democracy in the region is the role of the social media. The savvy that people in some of these countries have in using the social media to dismantle the apparatus of authoritarianism. Of course, in Iran, the reverse is also the case. The regime is extremely adept at using authoritarianism to control, to intimidate, to confuse. They have thousands of people engaged in cyber jihad. Again, in the election, you could see both sides. There was virtually a trench war going on. But the conservatives rallied around one person, a gentleman who had a very dark reputation as a hard-nosed jurist who was responsible for the murder of almost 4,000 people in prison. And you could see both sides, the conservatives coalescing around him and the people coalescing around what was clearly not their best alternative choice, but it was the choice that they thought they could use to chip away at the power of authoritarianism. Rouhani won. In the article that Larry kindly referred to, I point to some of the haggling that was done even after the election to make sure that Rouhani doesn't seem to win with too much of a margin. And immediately after the announcement, the conservatives have now realigned themselves, trying to make sure that Rouhani doesn't use his power to bring about too much change. We have just a report 2 days ago of a very tough meeting between the commanders of the IRGC, some of the top commanders of the IRGC, including the top commander and Soleimani, who is the head of the Quds Brigade, essentially reading the riot act to Rouhani in a private meeting, because Rouhani has been unabashedly critical of the role that the IRGC has in the economy, the role of the IRGC has in politics, the role they have in culture. It is estimated that minimally 30 to 40% of the Iranian economy is now controlled by IRGC or their front organizations, and they're not willing to give this up very easily. So part of the problem of this transition to democracy, part of the unknown factor of the future is whether a deal can be worked out, whether the IRGC economic juggernaut can more or less be left in their hands, and they can be convinced to forfeit some of the more authoritarian presence. My hope and my sense is that Iran's future is Turkey's past. Of the three countries, the one that I think might be more likely to have a democratic coup rather than an authoritarian resurgence, ironically, might be Iran. Thank you very much.